Actually, almost all prehistoric populations have a lot of dental wear. Definitely, many of the Native American populations, pre-contact populations, had excessive dental wear, whether it's from hide preparation, which they did, or sometimes it's the grit in their food that is either added to help grind it. Sometimes it's opening shellfish with their teeth, right? Or eating shellfish that has a lot of grit. The population that I mainly looked at was the California population, which was pre-contact. It was non-agricultural, but so you might think, oh, well, they would be really healthy, but they had a lot of dental wear. They didn't have a lot of cavities, because what happens when you wear your teeth down, you basically are wearing them down faster than a cavity can build. But basically what happens is get a second layer of...
I am here to discuss the so-called flying saucers.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's.
Did the CIA write Wind of Change by the Scorpions?
As humans busied themselves about the various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied.
Dr. Loeb, what percentage chance do you give it that you have indeed uncovered extraterrestrial or non-human technology?
With infinite complacence, people went about their affairs, yet across an immense ethereal gulf, intellects vast and unsympathetic drew their plans against us.
All of a sudden, a stick out of nowhere landed right in front of us, and there was no tree, nothing overhead. Something threw it at us.
Yeah.
All things unexplained.
So some of that, I think, sir, we'll save for closed session.
Hello, all you unexplained ones. Thank you so much for joining us for yet another exciting show. We are grateful to each and every one of you for tuning in. If you haven't yet, please do hit that subscribe button, share, like, comment. We love to hear all of your thoughts. We have some of the most intelligent people that join us in these chat rooms, and we hope that you will send your comments this way tonight. Before we begin, I am CJ Derringer. I am your host, along with my co-hosts, Dr. Tim Mounts and Smitty Neves. Hello, fellas.
Hey, what's up, CJ?
Not much. I'm super excited for this show. We have a very intelligent person, Dr. Elizabeth Weiss, joining us. She is an anthropologist, a professor from San Jose State University. She's also an author who has recently released a book called On the Warpath. I love this. My battle with Indians, Pretendians, and woke warriors. So I think we've got a lot to dive into on this show. She's also a board member of the National Association of Scholars. So we get to pick her brain about all kinds of fun things, unexplained things, maybe some controversial things. We'll dive into it in just a moment. So without further ado, stay tuned.
I can't wait. I think it's time for a little commercial.
Yes. All Things Unexplained is free to watch on YouTube and listen to wherever you get your podcasts. If you would like to support our show, you can visit our YouTube store. Additionally, you can find us on Venmo under All Things Unexplained. Be sure to check out our website, allthingsunexplained.com. All proceeds from the sales of Dr. Mounts' books on Amazon and Audible also go straight to our show. Dr. Elizabeth Weiss, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yes. So tell us a little bit about anthropology, which, by the way, was one of my absolute favorite classes in college. So I'm jealous that you took that path and got into it. But what inspired you to go that direction?
Well, anthropology is a broad field that it has several different subgenres or subfields in it. So there's cultural anthropology, which is the study of living people, like studying different cultures. There's archaeology, which studies the things left behind, right? So with artifacts, things as grand as the pyramids or Stonehenge to as small as an ostrich eggshell bead, right? And then there's linguistics, which is the study of language, and physical anthropology, sometimes called biological anthropology, which is the study of human biology, both our evolution and past peoples, how they lived. One of the interesting types of anthropology that joins two of the subtypes is bioarchaeology, which is the study of skeletal remains in the archaeological record. And that's where I fit in. So I basically am a bioarchaeologist. I study skeletal remains from prehistoric populations. And I got interested into anthropology because I love skeletal anatomy. One of the things when I was growing up, even as a very young child, I loved different aspects of science and nature, whether it was looking at animals, going to the zoo, for example, but also going to natural history museums and seeing all the displays of skeletons. Just fascinated me. And as I got older and in high school and then in college, that interest grew. And anthropology was a place where I could really dive into my love of anatomy coupled with my interest in understanding the past. And so what I do is I look at bones of past people to try to understand what their lives were like, giving a voice to those who left no written record. And it's been a fascinating, over 20 years now since I started looking at the remains of past people. And I've done everything from looking at skeletal remains of our earliest Homo species, Homo habilis, at about 2 million years old, to forensic cases that are basically collections of people who have donated their bodies and everything in between. And it never ceases to amaze me how wonderful the form and function of our bodies are, but also how similar we are to other animals and what we can all learn from just looking at bones.
That is so fascinating. And every time I hear about these discoveries where they have found some sort of bones that they are able to carbon date or what have you and can tell us about what people did in the past, it's unbelievable to me. I mean, it's really exciting when those types of things happen. Are you typically on these archaeological digs? Are you doing the aftermath of looking at the bones? Where does your role?
So what I did in my early career, I did go on some excavations. I spent 2 months in Kenya in field school. So there we looked at a 5,000-year-old burial site is one of the things we did. I've also spent time in the field in California and Big Sur doing an excavation of a pre-contact Californian Native American site, and I have even excavated on more urban campuses like Stanford on pre-contact California sites. But most of my career has been spent in the lab and looking at collections that have already been excavated and have been curated. So one of the things that a lot of people don't know about American anthropology is that most of our collections are actually what we call salvage sites. They're collections that have been excavated to prevent the destruction of them. For example, when the highway system was built, many sites were exposed, and there was basically two options. You either, bulldoze over them or you excavate them. And so that would, those kind of sites have been curated in museums and universities for many decades. And at San Jose State University, I curated one of the largest skeletal collections of pre-contact Native Americans west of the Mississippi from a single site. This collection had over 300 individuals represented, everything from infants to 60-year-old, probably not much older because they didn't live as long as we do. But and some of these remains were so beautifully complete, including all the bones, including like toe bones. It was an amazing experience to be able to do that, and not only for me to study that collection over the nearly 2 decades that I was at San Jose State, but also to help others gain access to that collection so they too can study it and learn from it and pass that knowledge on.
So when you're looking at these collections, what are you looking for? What is it that makes one tribe different from another, or what sort of signs are you looking for?
There are several different ways that I've conducted my research. I'm not a geneticist, so I don't do any DNA stuff. I love reading about that stuff. It's fascinating, but I haven't engaged in that. I've helped others do that, but I haven't helping them gain access to the remains, but I haven't done them myself. So, but what I've done is I've looked at a couple things. One thing is trauma patterns. So like the skeletal collection that I looked at had evidence of injuries from obsidian, arrowheads embedded in bone, to broken noses, to indents on the head, and kind of looking at the patterns of when the rise in trauma occurs and who is most likely to be injured. And we found, for example, not surprisingly, that males have more injuries than females, but that the pattern is also kind of a universal pattern where males have more front face injuries than females, so more like face-to-face combat, whereas when females got hit, a lot of times it was on the back. And that fortunately, children were almost always excluded from having these injuries, so they protected their children. That the rise in injuries coincided with invasions from other tribes, so that we know that this area did not contain only one type of people, but was being replaced by others as well. I've also looked at disease patterns. Probably the most common disease that you see in the skeletal record is osteoarthritis, or what we sometimes just call arthritis, degenerative joint disease. And what's interesting is when we compare like modern populations with past populations, everybody gets arthritis, right? Almost everybody, if you live long enough, you'll get some arthritis. But what we see in past populations is that their arthritis tends to come in earlier in their life and more severe and on different joints. So for example, most modern populations have high rates of knee arthritis. You don't see that very much in the pre-contact Native Americans that I studied. Rather, you see a lot of elbow and shoulder arthritis, likely from their activities that ranged from like acorn grinding to spear throwing. So that's another kind of patterns we look at to try to reconstruct the past. And sometimes just looking at interesting individuals. For example, one of the interesting individuals that I looked at had this very severe arthritis on his jaw that looked exceedingly severe, especially for his estimated age. And he was also buried with a huge amount of burial goods, and had some weird wear patterns on his teeth, which probably suggested that he was an artisan and had been using his mouth to do some of the tools like with twines, and that this then affected his whole jaw biology. And so sometimes it's just kind of fun to look at, what was this specific person's life like? And finally, I also do like general bone biology and forensic topics, like how do we best age and determine the age of an individual? Not how ancient it is, but when they died. And so looking at fusion patterns, for example. How do we sex an individual? How do we know if it's a male or female? And we're pretty good at that now, like almost 100% if we have an adult skeleton, but that is complete. But we're still, working on better ways to improve it when we have just fragments or when we have young individuals.
That is all very fascinating. And I know Smitty has some more scientific questions about how the whole process works. So Smitty, I'll toss it to you for a little bit.
Well, I actually was curious. Have you ever got to examine Joseph Merrick's skeleton?
No. So that is the Elephant Man, right?
Right, the Elephant Man.
Yeah. I have read quite a bit about his case, and it's interesting. I mean, he had definitely a genetic disorder that causes excessive bone growth. And you will, if you look at the bones, you will see this was not just soft tissue, of course. And it looks to be that Merrick died from this, from his pathology that ended up suffocating him.
Yeah.
And we don't know why some of these pathologies occur. Sometimes it can be just, random mutation, but there are similar types of pathologies that also occur as a result of certain toxins that just affect certain, bones, for example, of the jaw or of the face. I'm pretty sure that they have looked at his DNA, but I couldn't be 100% sure on that.
Well, what's the process when you get a skeleton? Can you give us somewhat of an overview of what the process is to determine all the facts about this particular skeleton? And as growing up as a kid, was your favorite song "Them Bones"? You know,
I love country music, so
Yeah.
them bones, digging up bones,
Yeah. Randy
Randy
Travis.
Travis shout out.
Yeah.
right. So I do love those songs.
Mhm.
Yeah. So one of the first things you do, depending on the site, is you might, if you have commingled remains, you have to start trying to figure out which bones belong to who. So you do that with age and size and sex. So trying to build up, the whole skeleton as making sure you don't have several individuals represented in one skeleton. What's interesting is, maybe we'll probably cover some of this later on too, but Kennewick Man, the nearly 9,000-year-old Paleo-Indian found in Washington in the 1990s, he was almost complete, right? So he is almost a complete skeleton. And yet he was taken away from access from the scientists and held by the government, who was letting people, various religious groups, visit Kennewick Man for their religious purposes, not only Native Americans, but also like neo-pagans. And one of the first things that was done after these various groups were visiting Kennewick Man was the group of scientists did an assessment of the skeleton, a reassessment of the skeleton, and they noticed that 2 of the leg bones were left leg bones. So somebody had swapped one of the Kennewick Man's bones with another one, and they didn't get the side right. So things like that. So figuring out, what bones belong with who, right? But then afterwards, you really want to start with doing things like determining the sex of the skeleton, is it a male or female, determining the age of the skeleton, and we're really bad at age determination or age estimation. We're pretty good at sex determination, right? Especially if we have an adult. But for example, we're good at saying, if somebody is not yet grown up or grown up, but once all their bones have fused, it's kind of hard to tell if somebody is 50 like me or 65, know? So we're not that good at that.
I was going to ask you if Native American women's teeth in the Midwest, were their teeth down because they chewed? I always heard that they chewed hides to soften the hides up and that their teeth would be worn.
Actually, almost all prehistoric populations have a lot of dental wear, but definitely many of the Native American populations, pre-contact populations, had excessive dental wear, whether it's from hide preparation, which they did, or sometimes it's a grit in their food that is either added to help grind it. Sometimes it's opening shellfish with their teeth, right? Or eating shellfish that has a lot of grit. The population that I mainly looked at was the California population, which was pre-contact. It was non-agricultural, but so you might think, oh well, they would be really healthy, but they had a lot of dental wear. They didn't have a lot of cavities, because what happens when you wear your teeth down, you basically are wearing them down faster than a cavity can build.
Right.
But basically what happens is you get a second layer of dentin below to protect the pulp, and then a third layer. But if this doesn't happen quick enough, you will get an abscess where bacteria has entered into the tooth cavity pulp, and then it can enter into the bloodstream, of course, and cause sepsis or blood poisoning. And it is pretty well documented that in pre-contact America and in many prehistoric populations, dental disease was the #1 killer, just because of this blood poisoning. So yes, we definitely look at that. And so we look at disease patterns, we look at whether there's trauma, whether this is a single population or not. So, we obviously can use DNA to help us figure out some of these things. But sometimes, DNA is expensive, more expensive than just looking at a bone, time consuming, and it doesn't always work. So, sometimes the DNA is not preserved well enough. But also, when you do a DNA study on a sample to try to figure out where it's from, or how old it is, or whether it's a male or female, like in young individuals, you don't always test the whole sample, because, like every individual in the sample, you test 1 or 2, maybe a half a dozen if you have a lot of resources. And so what we can do to look at whether people are related is we look at their traits. We look at whether they have shovel-shaped incisors or not, whether their incisors are flat or whether they have a ridge on them. We look at whether they have what we call a metopic suture, which is a suture that separates the frontal bone, the left and right, just normal variation, right? So, but if you look at it, about 30 of these traits, you can then draw a family tree and figure out, was this one population? Was this 2 populations? Did populations change over time? And we can reconstruct this site, because many sites are not a moment in time, but they span. So in the San Jose site, for example, the Ryan Mound spans about 2,500 years or so. So, you can't just look at one skeleton or a handful of skeletons and say, okay, this is one population. You have to look at as many as possible to reconstruct that that location.
Well, I'm going to give it back to CJ, but thank you.
Yes. Yeah. And for anybody that is tuning in live with us, if you have questions for Dr. Elizabeth Weiss, please do put them in our chat. We're going to try and pull those in for our listener questions later. But at this point, I'm dying to dive into this book that you have written, because the title alone tells me that you have experienced probably a few bumps in the road in your anthropology journey in terms of people that you've interacted with, and maybe there's been some pushback on your work. So tell us about your book, what inspired it, and what people can expect when they read it.
Okay, so first thing I want to say is that the book is written for a general audience. So if you're listening and you're thinking, oh, it's an academic book, I'm not going to be able to read it, like I wouldn't be able to read a textbook on physics, right? It's not like that. This is written for a general audience. I tried to make it as jargonless as possible. And my husband, Nick Pope, proofread it and gave me some pointers whenever I got to academies. So, so basically what happened is there's a law called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And there are state laws that are similar. And the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act is called NAGPRA. And so like the state law of California is called CalNAGPRA. And this law is in order to repatriate or rebury. So repatriate basically means to give bones back, to give skeletal remains and artifacts like funerary objects or sacred artifacts back to a modern tribe that is linked to the past collection. And that was the intent, to make sure that when there was a clear link, that the tribe who was linked to the skeletal collection, the artifacts, would get the remains and artifacts back if they wanted to, and then rebury them if they wanted to.
So may I
And-
ask just a quick question about that? Was it a religious reason? Was there like, did the Native Americans
Yes,
believe that their remains needed to be buried?
There is definitely religious reasons for it. Many Native Americans argue that it is necessary for their religious practices to have certain artifacts, and that they believe that their ancestors' spirits needs to be buried. And to be clear, I am against all reburial. I love skeletal remains so much that I just think it's such a travesty to rebury remains. I would say this for Native American remains. I'd say it for European remains. I don't want the bog bodies of Europe to be reburied either. So I'm just against reburial. I understand that not everybody's going to agree with that, but I do feel that it's important to be able to voice that and voice why I think that reburial is problematic for the science, but also a kind of a loss. And that I would hope that we could move towards a direction where we understand that studying skeletal remains is important to not only give a voice to the past, but to help forensics, help medicine. And I'm just against reburial from all those perspectives. But I've always followed the law. So, but one of the things is that I've always voiced this opinion. One of my first articles was on Kennewick Man and how I didn't think Kennewick Man should be reburied. So I wrote a book that was set to come out at the 30th anniversary of NAGPRA. So NAGPRA was passed in 1990, and I co-authored the book with now retired attorney James W. Springer, and called Repatriation and Erasing the Past. And we put forth our best argument for why reburials shouldn't occur. So he attacked the legality of it. Part of it being that NAGPRA actually violates the separation of church and state, because it sets up the requirement that that the NAGPRA committee must have 2 traditional Indian religious leaders in it. So not just 2 Indian religious leaders, but a specific type of religion. And the First Amendment, of course, it supports the right to practice religion, but it also is about not supporting one religion over another. And so by saying, it's not just good enough that this person is a religious leader, it has to be of a specific religion. That's where it's problematic, for example. And I wrote most of the area of why what we can learn from the bones, and therefore why we shouldn't rebury them. But we also argued that reburial laws and what we call repatriation ideology is a postmodern ideology, because it's basically based on identity politics. It says it doesn't matter if the narrative is correct. It only matters that you're getting the narrative from the correct identity person, and that in that case Native Americans. And so in many stories of repatriation and reburial, you'll see lines like, we want to be the only ones to tell our story, or we don't need scientists to tell us our story. And so now anthropologists should be saying, hold on, science is not about Native American scholars or European scholars. Science is for everyone. The truth is the truth. The search for the truth is not about identity, and so forth. But unfortunately, that's not how anthropology has gone. And what happened upon the publication of Repatriation and Erasing the Past is that there was a huge cancel culture campaign that tried to get the book banned. Almost 900 people academics signed an open letter calling for my publishers to pull the book. This then trickled down to my university, where my chair wrote a letter about how he supported my academic freedom, but he does think that my book is terrible and Victorian and all this. Then after the book was published and after all of this happened, things like bubbled away a little bit and then calmed down. This was December 2020, so right before Christmas. I think it was literally on like Christmas Eve or the eve before that I got the first email from my publisher saying, we're in crisis mode, we don't know what to do. And they issued a groveling letter apologizing for publishing the book, but they did not depublish it. They called it a racist book, and basically apologized for publishing this racist book. And it's kind of interesting. Those 900 people who signed the open letter, I don't think all of them read it, because if it had been read by 900 academics within a matter of a month, it would have been like the best, most read anthropology.
Yeah, the best-selling anthropology book.
This is not good. That did not happen, right? So, but after this like bubbled away and it kind of fizzled out and things settled, then in the spring, in April, I was to give a talk, and of course this is during COVID era, so it was on Zoom. It was a conference of Society for American Archaeology, which is the largest of the academic or scholarly archaeology conferences in the U.S. I gave a talk that said, and I can't remember the exact title, but it was something like, we shouldn't let creation myths determine our repatriation. We shouldn't let creation myths sneak into our science, kind of a thing. And so I gave the talk, and the talk was basically about how if we're going to make reburial and repatriation decisions, then those decisions should be based on science. It should be based on DNA studies, on historical documents, on biology, bone biology. They shouldn't be made based on myth. And so another reason why NAGPRA, the reburial law, violates the First Amendment is that it allows us evidence creation myths from Native Americans, which you could not do the same for other religions. I couldn't now try to claim Otzi, the 5,000-year-old, Iceman from the Alps, by claiming that my neo-pagan ancestry sprung from those mountain regions, even though I'm European. This would not be allowed, but it's allowed in with repatriation decisions. And so my argument was that although I'm against reburial and repatriation, if it has to be, we should still make them based on the best evidence possible. This caused a huge fury at the conference, with people claiming that they were harmed and that my speech was harmful, violent. It's kind of interesting. Speech is violence, but also silence is violence in these days. So you can't win, right?
You can't win, no.
And what happened was this talk was supposed to be on the website after the conference for 2 months, and they pulled the talk, and they basically issued an apology for platforming the talk. Then they decided that they would change the acceptance rules to ensure that people with my ideas or similar ideas, or even just questioning any reburial and repatriation issues, will never get on again. That was basically the end outcome. But what happened during that time when this cancellation arose is I started noticing that there were all these what I call neo-tribes of anthropology that have sprung up that just kind of I didn't notice. For example, the Queer Archaeology Interest Group decided to write a letter against my talk. So did the Black Trowel Collective. So did the, Latina, Latine, Latinx anthropology group, like all these, what I would call identity politics interest groups came up. And that showed me that anthropology and archaeology has really taken a turn where now it's not about only the Native American narrative that they're saying, you shouldn't disagree with that because they are an oppressed people and we should accept their narrative, but really that anybody with a victimology or victimhood status needs to have their voice heard kind of argument. And so we get people no longer interested in reconstructing the past and trying to really tell the story of how past people's lives were lived, but rather putting their own identity politics onto the past. And you get archaeology like through the queer lens, where they look at every site trying to find evidence that there was queer, queer Neanderthals, or and this is definitely has taken anthropology astray.
Let me ask you a quick question, if you don't mind, about the science of it. So when these bones are reburied, does that break a link in the science for piecing together these different tribes? Is that the biggest issue with the reburial?
To be continued. All things unexplained.
What's your hot take on Travis Taylor?
I've got an exclusive for you guys if you want it about the Alaska.
We do.
Okay.
Dr. Taylor was revealed to be the chief scientist of the UAP task force with the Pentagon.
So some of that, I think, sir, we'll save for closed session.
All Things Unexplained is free to watch on YouTube and listen to wherever you get your podcasts. If you would like to support our show, you can visit our YouTube store. Additionally, you can find us on Venmo under All Things Unexplained. Be sure to check out our website, allthingsunexplained.com. All proceeds from the sales of Dr. Mounce's books on Amazon and Audible also go straight to our show.